Hello and welcome back to Bookish. I am really excited about today's video. I don't think I've looked forward to making a video more than this one. This is our second update on our read-along of Light in August, in which I'm going to talk about Faulkner's work in chapters 2 through 6 here. First of all, let me just say I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I think these chapters 2 through 6 clearly indicate that Faulkner is a great writer. He is a master of plotting. He's a master of characterization. He's a master of the use of language, and he can even be experimental in the way he plots and timelines his novels. This is just, to me, a masterwork by a great writer, and I don't think anything proves it more than chapter 2. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all 5 chapters, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, but I'm going to spend most of my time on chapter 2 because chapter 2 just blows me away. If you're reading along with us and you read chapter 1, you notice that in chapter 1 almost nothing happens. We learn that Lena's pregnant, she's trying to find her husband, and a man agrees to take her to the town of Jefferson in his wagon, and along the way they notice the house is on fire. And in chapter 2 is almost the exact opposite. So much happens in chapter 2. We learn so much more about the story and the characters, and in many ways this is just a master class in characterization and how to create characters in just a few sentences. For me, my favorite character, at least in the first half of chapter 2, is Mooney. Mooney is a man who works at the sawmill with Byron Bunch, who's going to be an incredibly important character moving forward. The very sawmill that Lena is going for, looking for her, well, the man who impregnated her, Lucas Birch. And Mooney is a great example of using a character to help you understand the character of other characters in just a few words. Mooney is wise, he understands human motivations, and he brilliantly assesses the character of both Joe Christmas and of a character whose last name is Brown, who will show up and go to work at the sawmill. We also learn through the interactions between Mooney and Byron Bunch in this chapter that Byron is good-hearted, he's hardworking, he's fairly naive. We're also going to learn that he is religiously devout, and he is very different, and his character is in contrast to a lot of the other characters in the book. So in this chapter we learn that Brown can't be trusted, that he's lazy, that he's relatively shiftless, that, perhaps he's somewhat harmless, even though, as we'll find out, he's capable of doing a tremendous amount of harm. We learn that Joe Christmas is odd, that he stands out, that he appears to be arrogant, that there is kind of an almost kind of controlled, perhaps violence in Joe Christmas that makes people stay away from him and he stay away from people. We learn that he is also, a criminal who's engaged in criminal activity and currently engaged in criminal activity. We learn about Miss Joanna Burden, who is the descendant of abolitionists who came south to Mississippi to try to help enslave people and the newly freed slaves after the Civil War came to an end, who died violently and who is unwelcome in the community of Jefferson. There's some foreshadowing here in what's going to happen to Joanna Burden, and there's also, we begin to see the characterization of Jefferson itself, because Jefferson is not a racially tolerant person. Let's see. It's also in chapter 2 that we begin to get hints about Joe Christmas's mixed race heritage. There are hints dropped by Faulkner throughout chapter 2. He talks about his face being dark or darkened. He compares his skin color to baked parchment, which would not be quite white, not be quite brown. He talks about, or the characters talk about him, and reference things about him which make him appear to be an African American. One of them says, "Have you ever heard of a white man named Christmas?" They point out that he lives at Miss Burden's place person whose family had harbored and tried to help African Americans. He lives in Miss Burden's place in a shack in which African Americans had used to live. And the job that he does, which is essentially just shoveling and moving sawdust, is a job that's described as a job for an African American. So there are lots of hints about Joe Christmas's mixed race heritage, which would be a really important part of the story. This is also the chapter in which Byron Bunch meets Lena Grove. Lena comes to the sawmill looking for Lucas Birch, and she meets instead Byron Bunch. And during that meeting, he falls in love with her almost immediately. And he will spend a lot of the next chapters that we go over in this read-along section trying to protect her and trying to help her any way that he can. We also learn in the course of this, as if Chapter 2 didn't have enough in it, we also learn that the character whose last name is Brown is actually Lucas Birch, the man who impregnated Lena Grove. Byron realizes it, and he's going to try to do something about that. And it's also in Chapter 2 that we see references to the fire. So Chapter 3 introduces a new character. This is a character who we learn that Byron Bunch goes to meet on a regular basis and have conversations with. His name is Hightower, and he was a Presbyterian preacher before he was drummed out of his church. This had in large part to do with people not being happy with his sermons, which always had a tendency to come back to Jefferson's violent past during the Civil War, and the fact that he clearly has a bad relationship with his wife. His wife cheats on him. As a matter of fact, his wife is going to die by jumping from a hotel room in Memphis, which she'd been occupying with another man and they had registered as husband and wife. The church tries to get him to leave. They fire him. They try to get him to leave Jefferson. He is an embarrassment. Again, notice how intolerant the community is of something that Hightower hasn't really done wrong. He does give up his position in the church, but he refuses to leave Jefferson. He uses the money that they tried to buy him off with to buy a house, but the community won't leave him alone. When they find out that he's living in that house with an African-American cook, they decide that the African-American cook and he are up to no good. Masked men break into his house, and they warn him that he needs to leave. Those same masked men terrorize his African-American cook, who quits the job and leaves. When he won't leave, townspeople, who I'm just going to call the KKK, show up, take him out in the forest and beat him almost to death and leave him tied to a tree, but he still refuses to leave. There are a lot of interesting things, I think, that are going on here in this discussion about Hightower, some of which are not resolved here, but I think that Faulkner is using Hightower to display oftentimes the racial intolerance of the South and of Jefferson, Mississippi. I made a video in which I talked about Faulkner being a racist, and I said he was a particular kind of racist in that he essentially was a paternal racist, in which he thought, white people just knew better what African Americans should do and when African Americans should be able to get their rights and should direct the lives of African Americans. That's a particular kind of racism. But notice that Faulkner here isn't supporting the racism of Jefferson. As a matter of fact, this is some of the clearest anti-racist statements and scenes that Faulkner puts in his book are in Light in August, which in reality, as I think Alan mentioned in a comment or in an earlier video, is kind of the theme of this book. Anyway, so Chapter 3 is kind of essentially all about Hightower, who will be kind of the person who listens to Byron tell the rest of the story, trying to pick up speed and not to spend too much time on anything else. Chapter 4 is essentially describes the relationship between Joe Christmas and Joanna Burden, who he's having a sexual relationship with, and then Brown, who becomes his business partner in selling whiskey, which they stole from another bootlegger, and they're selling whiskey around town as a way of making money. This is why both men quit the sawmill, and they go out to live on the Burden place, but still are living in one of the shacks out behind the place in which African Americans used to occupy. It's during Chapter 4 that Christmas reveals to Brown, or Birch, however, whatever we want to call him, reveals to Brown that he is of mixed race heritage. It's in this chapter that we learn about the fire. We learn what happens to Joanna Burden. It's in this chapter that Brown betrays Christmas by telling the sheriff who has brought Brown in relationship to the fire and the finding of Joanna Burden's dead body in the house, almost decapitated, brings him in to question him about that and more or less accuses him of the crime. To get out of that accusation, Brown says that Christmas is in fact an African American mixed race man, and automatically the whole community's concept of who's guilty shifts to Joe Christmas, whether he is or not, again betraying the racism. In chapter 4 we see, Christmas is enraged with Joanna Burden. He at one point, and he's enraged with her for praying over him. We don't really know in these chapters. In chapter 4 we don't really know exactly why this makes him so angry, but at one point he strips himself down naked and is outside her bedroom window, more or less muttering threats and curses at her. A car comes over a hill and he's caught fully naked in the headlights of the car, and he stands there revealing himself to what he assumes is a car full of white people standing there cursing him, and I think this is Christmas revealing himself for who he is. Chapter 5 is about Joe Christmas. We learn a little bit more about Christmas and his relationship with Joanna Burden, his relationship with the community. It is clear, by the way, one of the things you kind of have to, that makes reading Light in August a little bit challenging, is that Faulkner is continually going backwards and forward in time. So chapter 5, we step back a few days from the fire to learn about Christmas's activities before then. He realizes that he has made a huge mistake by revealing to Brown that he is of mixed race heritage. He begins making preparations either to leave Jefferson or preparations for the murder of Joanna Burden, and the aftermath of that. He walks through the town, and in this, Faulkner gives us several examples of how Christmas literally doesn't fit in. When he walks to the African American neighborhoods, he doesn't feel like he belongs there. When he walks to the white neighborhoods of town, he has a longing for what those people have, but that he'll never have. He confronts a group of African Americans on the road hostilely, and they identify him as a white man, and they move around him, and they're afraid of what's going to happen. There's a lot of the tension we feel building up in Joe Christmas in chapter 5. In chapter 6, maybe we learn a little bit of why that is. We see Christmas as a child at the age of 5 who has, however he's found out, has begun breaking into or sneaking into the apartment of the dietitian at the orphanage where he's being kept, and he's obsessed with eating her toothpaste. This is, I have to admit, this is one of those kind of, I assume, symbolic things that I'm not exactly sure about, except that the toothpaste that he eats is pink, and the dietitian is described as oftentimes as being kind of pink. So I don't know if there's supposed to be kind of a symbolic racial thing there, sexual thing there. Anyway, he inadvertently is caught in the room. He was hiding behind a curtain while the dietitian and another man who worked in the orphanage had sex. She's afraid he's going to tell everybody what she's done. She realizes there's a janitor on campus or at the orphanage who seems to hate Joe Christmas. She tries to enlist him in getting rid of Christmas, and he does, in fact, take little Joe Christmas away from that orphanage and try all the way to Arkansas and try to put him in another orphanage there. Interestingly, he tries to put him in an orphanage in Arkansas that is an orphanage for white children. But eventually, the janitor and Christmas are brought back to Mississippi, and then he's sent to an orphanage for African Americans, which is what the dietitian wanted. The relationship between Christmas and this janitor are interesting. The janitor appears to help him. At the same time, he appears to hate him. At the same time, he kind of tries to take care of him. He tries to remove him from the orphanage before he could be removed and sent to an African American orphanage and place him in another orphanage. The janitor arrived just a few months before Joe Christmas did, and there's an implication that there's some connection between them. that's just one of the mysteries that will have to be solved as we continue reading Light in August. What is the relationship between Joe Christmas and this janitor? Who really killed Joanna Burton? Was it Christmas? Was it Brown? And what's going to happen with Lena and Byron? You know, how is that story going to play itself out? Oh, also, by the way, why is Joe Christmas the way he is? Why is he violent and angry and resentful? And I have a feeling that has something to do with the fact that he is adopted by a white family who appears like they're going to be very strict. Anyway, that will be for chapters 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Yes. That will be for the next 5 chapters, which we'll talk about next Saturday. Look forward to your comments and discussion. Please, if you want to make your own videos about these chapters or about Faulkner, go right ahead. And if I don't find them, let me know. Leave me a link in the comments, and I will link your video in with mine and with Alan's. The more discussion about this we get, the happier I'm going to be, because I just think this is such a great book, and I'm really fired up to read the rest and talk to you about it.